An elderly couple pretended to be homeless, and only the daughter-in-law they hated opened the door. After decades of sacrifice, they disguised themselves as desperate strangers to test their 5 successful children. One by one, the doctor, the lawyer, the executive, the banker, all turned their own parents away without a second glance. But when they reached the doorstep of their youngest son, the one they'd called a failure, something shocking happened. Peter and Ruby Grayson had spent 43 years building a family. They were about to discover, in the span of 72 hours, whether that family had ever truly existed at all. The morning it all began, Peter stood in front of their bedroom mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. He was 71 years old, and until this moment, he had always taken pride in his appearance. Pressed shirts, clean shaves, shoes polished every Sunday evening while Ruby read beside him in the living room. These small rituals had defined their retirement years, the quiet dignity of a life well lived. But today, Peter wore clothes he'd pulled from a donation bin behind the Methodist Church on 5th Street, a stained gray jacket 2 sizes too large, pants with a tear at the knee that he'd deliberately widened with his pocket knife, shoes that had lost their laces somewhere in another man's journey. Ruby emerged from the bathroom, and Peter's chest tightened. His wife of 43 years, the woman who had taught piano lessons for 3 decades, who had sewn Halloween costumes until her fingers ached, who had packed lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside, looked like a stranger. Her silver hair, usually swept into an elegant twist, hung loose and tangled. She wore a shapeless brown dress they'd found at a thrift store, its hem uneven and fraying. A thin cardigan with missing buttons completed the transformation. "You look terrible," Peter said softly. Ruby managed a small smile. "So do you." They stood together in silence, 2 people who had raised 5 children, funded 4 college educations, co-signed 3 mortgages, and written more checks than they could count for graduations and weddings and grandchildren's birthday presents. 2 people who had given everything they had and were about to find out what any of it had meant. The idea had come to Peter 3 weeks earlier, on the night of his 70th birthday, or rather, on the night his 70th birthday should have been celebrated. Ruby had called each of their children personally. Victoria, their eldest, a cardiologist in Boston. Richard, a corporate attorney in Chicago. Margaret, married to a tech executive and living in a house with more bathrooms than their childhood home had rooms. Stephen, an investment banker who'd made his first million before 30. And Daniel, their youngest. The disappointment. Victoria couldn't make it. A conference in Switzerland. Richard had a deposition that couldn't be moved. Margaret's husband had planned a getaway to Napa, and she couldn't possibly cancel. Stephen was closing a deal that would determine the trajectory of his entire career. Only Daniel had said yes immediately. Daniel, who lived 90 miles away in a farmhouse with a leaking roof, married to a woman the family had never approved of, working as a handyman while his wife grew vegetables and raised chickens. Daniel, who drove his 12-year-old truck through a thunderstorm to sit at his father's birthday table with a homemade card and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than he could afford. That night, after Daniel and his wife Jenny had driven home, after Peter had cleaned up the cake that only 4 people had touched, he'd sat in his study and done something he'd never done before. He cried, and then he started planning. "Are you sure about this?" Ruby asked now, adjusting the strap of the worn canvas bag she carried. Inside was a change of clothes, their medications hidden in an aspirin bottle, $200 in emergency cash, and a small notebook where Peter intended to record everything. "I need to know," Peter said. "We need to know. And if the answer is what we're afraid of..." Peter took her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warmth of late September. "Then at least we'll know, and we can stop wondering why our phone only rings when someone needs something." They had created a story. A simple one, because the best lies are built on truth. They were Peter and Ruby Miller, not Chen, retired factory workers, not a former high school principal and piano teacher. They'd lost their home to medical bills after Peter's heart surgery. The details would be vague, because desperate people rarely have the energy for elaborate explanations. The first stop was Boston. They took a bus because driving their own car would have ruined the illusion. 12 hours of watching America scroll past grimy windows, surrounded by other travelers who carried their lives in bags and kept their eyes fixed on middle distances. Ruby dozed against Peter's shoulder while he stared at his reflection in the glass and wondered if Victoria would even recognize them. Victoria's neighborhood announced itself through increasingly manicured lawns and iron gates. Her home, a restored Victorian with a Tesla in the driveway and a lawn service that came twice weekly, sat on a tree-lined street where the silence felt expensive. Peter and Ruby walked the final mile from the bus stop. By the time they reached Victoria's address, Ruby was limping slightly, and Peter's back ached from the cheap seats of the Greyhound. They looked, he realized with grim satisfaction, exactly like what they were pretending to be. Exhausted, desperate, invisible. Victoria's housekeeper answered the door. "We're looking for some help," Peter said, keeping his voice humble, his eyes lowered. "We've been traveling a long way. We're just wondering if there's any food you might spare, or perhaps some work we could do in exchange for a meal." The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an accent Peter couldn't place, looked at them with genuine sympathy. "Wait here," she said softly. "Let me ask." They waited on the porch for 7 minutes. Peter counted each one. When the door opened again, it wasn't the housekeeper. It was Victoria. Peter's heart hammered against his ribs. His daughter, his firstborn, the baby whose first steps he'd filmed on a camcorder the size of a small suitcase. The girl who'd made him promise to walk her down the aisle, who'd cried in his arms when she didn't get into her first-choice medical school, who'd called him sobbing when her first patient died on her table. She didn't recognize him. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, her voice carrying the polished tone she'd cultivated for patients' families. "We don't give handouts. There's a shelter about 4 miles from here. They serve dinner at 6. She reached into her pocket and produced a $20 bill, extending it without making eye contact. "For bus fare." Ruby made a small sound beside him. Peter squeezed her hand in warning. "Thank you," he said quietly, accepting the money. "God bless you." Victoria was already closing the door. "Rosa, make sure they leave the property before you lock up." The door clicked shut. They stood on the porch for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then Peter guided Ruby down the steps and back to the sidewalk, his hand trembling against her arm. "She didn't know us," Ruby whispered. "No," Peter agreed. "She didn't even look." They found a park bench 3 blocks away and sat in the gathering dusk. Ruby's shoulders shook with silent tears. Peter stared at the $20 bill in his hand, his daughter's price for making homeless people disappear from her doorstep. "We could stop," he offered. "We don't have to do this." Ruby wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We've come this far, and I need to know if Victoria is, if she's all of them." The next morning, they took another bus, this time to Chicago. Richard's building was a steel and glass tower that pierced the skyline like an accusation against the modest neighborhood surrounding it. He lived in the penthouse, which meant security guards and key cards and intercoms that filtered who was worthy of entry. Peter and Ruby didn't even get inside the building. The doorman, a young man with forearms like ham hocks and eyes that had seen every trick in the book, stopped them at the entrance. "Building residents only. We're trying to reach someone on the top floor," Peter said. "Richard Chen. He's our—" He caught himself. "We knew his parents once. We're hoping he might help us." The doorman's expression didn't change. "Mr. Grayson doesn't accept visitors without an appointment. If you'd like to leave a message, I can see it gets to his assistant." Peter thought of his son, Richard, who'd been terrified of thunderstorms until he was 12. Richard, who'd begged for a dog every Christmas until they finally caved and brought home a golden retriever named Scout. Richard, who'd delivered the eulogy at his grandmother's funeral with such eloquence that the minister had pulled Peter aside afterward and said, "That boy has a gift. Could you tell him," Peter said slowly, "that 2 people who once loved him very much are outside and need help?" The doorman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir, I think you might be confused. You should probably just tell him, please." Whether out of pity or professional duty, the doorman made the call. Peter watched him speak into the phone, watched him glance back at them, watched his expression shift into something like embarrassment. "Mr. Grayson says he doesn't know anyone matching your description," the doorman reported. "He suggested I direct you to the city's homeless services hotline." He handed over a card, pre-printed with a number. "There are warming centers that open at 7 if you need somewhere to stay tonight." Ruby's hand found Peter's. Her grip was tight enough to hurt. "Thank you," Peter managed. They walked to Millennium Park and sat by the Bean, that massive silver sculpture where Peter had once posed for photographs with all 5 of his children during a family trip. Tourists swirled around them, but no one stopped. No one looked. They had become part of the landscape. Just two more figures hunched on a bench, irrelevant to the beautiful people taking selfies. 2 down, Ruby said, her voice flat. 3 to go. Margaret lived in Palo Alto, which was too far for buses and beyond their dwindling resources. But fate, or perhaps something else, intervened when Peter spotted a rideshare posting on a community board at the bus station. A young woman named Destiny was driving to San Francisco and needed help with gas money. She was 23, with multicolored braids and a nose ring, and she asked more questions in the first hour than Victoria had asked in the past 5 years. "So, where are you headed, really?" Destiny asked, glancing at them in her rearview mirror. "And don't say you're just wandering. Nobody your age wanders without a destination." Peter looked at Ruby, then back at the young woman. "We're visiting family." "Dressed like that?" Ruby surprised him by laughing, a real laugh, the first in days. "It's a long story. Lady, we've got 600 miles. I've got time." Peter found himself talking. Not the full truth, but enough of it. How they'd raised 5 children. How those children had grown successful and distant. How this trip was meant to answer a question that had been eating at them for years. Destiny was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "My grandma raised me after my mom couldn't. Never had much, but she gave me everything that mattered. When she got sick last year, I moved back home for 6 months to take care of her. Lost my job, almost lost my apartment." She shrugged. "Worth it, though. Some things you don't put a price on." They drove in comfortable silence after that. When Destiny dropped them at a bus stop 30 miles from Palo Alto, she refused to take their gas money. "You need it more than I do," she said. "And whatever you find at the end of this trip, I hope it's what you're looking for." Peter thought about that as they walked the remaining miles to Margaret's neighborhood. What was he looking for? Proof that his children loved him? Confirmation that they didn't? Some version of the truth he could live with? He wasn't sure anymore. Margaret's house was somehow worse than Victoria's, not because it was less grand, but because it was so clearly designed to impress. A modern architectural statement that had been featured in a magazine Ruby had seen in a dentist's waiting room, all angles and glass, and a pool that probably cost more than Peter's entire annual pension. They rang the doorbell at 3 in the afternoon. Margaret's husband, Thomas, answered. Peter had never liked Thomas. His 2 white teeth, his firm handshake as performance, his way of making every conversation about his own achievements. But he'd never said anything because Margaret seemed happy, and that was what mattered. Thomas didn't recognize his father-in-law. "Can I help you?" The words were polite, but his body blocked the doorway, already preparing to close it. "We're traveling through," Peter said, hoping to find some kindness. "A meal, maybe, or just some water." Thomas's expression flickered with something Peter couldn't quite read. Disgust? Annoyance? Fear? "Margaret," Thomas called over his shoulder. "There are some people at the door." Peter's daughter appeared, their middle child, the one who'd been terrified of the dark until she was 14, who'd made him check under her bed every night and leave the hallway light on, the one who'd written him a letter when she graduated college that said, "Everything I am, I learned from watching you." She was wearing yoga clothes that probably cost more than Destiny's monthly rent. Her hair was perfect. Her nails were perfect. Everything about her was curated and controlled. "What do they want?" Margaret asked, not addressing them directly. "They say they're looking for food or water." Margaret sighed, the sound of inconvenience. "Thomas, we've talked about this. We can't just let random people come to the door." The neighborhood watch group specifically said, "We're sorry to bother you," Ruby spoke up, her voice carrying steel beneath the weariness. "We'll go." Margaret looked at them then, really looked, for perhaps 3 seconds. Long enough for recognition to flicker, if it was going to. It didn't. "Wait," Margaret said. She disappeared and returned a moment later with a reusable shopping bag. Inside were 2 bottles of water and what looked like leftover sandwiches wrapped in paper towels. "These are from a catering event. They were going to be thrown out anyway." She handed the bag to Ruby, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you," Ruby said. Peter could hear the tears she was fighting. "There's a motel about 2 miles east," Margaret continued. "They might have day rates, and the soup kitchen downtown opens at 5. She smiled, her professional smile, the one she used for charity galas. "Good luck." The door closed. Peter and Ruby walked until they found a bus stop bench, then sat in the California sunshine eating sandwiches their daughter had almost thrown away. "She didn't know us either," Ruby said. No. She looked right at me, Peter, her mother, and she saw a stranger. Peter had no words. He put his arm around his wife and held her while she cried, and he thought about the girl who used to run to him whenever she scraped her knee, certain that his kiss could make anything better. They had 2 children left to visit, Stephen, in Seattle, and Daniel, just 90 miles from home. Part of Peter wanted to skip Stephen, to go straight to Daniel's farmhouse and end this painful experiment, but Ruby insisted. "We have to know," she said. "All of them. If we leave Stephen out, we'll always wonder." So they took another bus, another endless journey through an America that seemed designed for people who could afford to move faster than they were moving. Peter's back screamed with every pothole. Ruby's cough, which she'd been hiding, grew worse. By the time they reached Seattle, 3 days had passed since they'd left home. They'd spent 2 nights in bus stations, one in a shelter that smelled of disinfectant and desperation, and they'd eaten whatever food they could find at gas stations and convenience stores. Their disguises no longer felt like disguises. They were becoming the people they pretended to be. Stephen's building was in a neighborhood that had been poor once, and was now suffocating under the weight of its own trendiness. Breweries and boutiques and apartments, where young people with big dreams paid fortunes to live in spaces smaller than closets. Stephen's apartment was on the 4th floor. No doorman this time, just a buzzer system. Peter pressed the button next to his son's name. The intercom crackled. "Yeah? We're looking for help," Peter said. "Food," or "Wrong apartment." The intercom went dead. Peter pressed again. "I said wrong apartment." "Please," Ruby spoke into the intercom. "We've come such a long way. We just need—" "Lady, I don't know how you got into the building, but I'm not opening my door for strangers. There's a shelter on Pine Street. Go there." Peter pressed the button a 3rd time. Silence. They stood in the hallway for several minutes. 2 old people who smelled like bus stations and looked like everything the world wanted to forget existed. Then Peter took Ruby's hand, and they walked back down the stairs and out into the Seattle drizzle. 4 children, 4 chances, 4 closed doors. 1 more remained. If you're following this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had your heart broken by family? Stay with me. What happens next changed everything. The bus ride toward Daniel's town felt different from the others. Maybe it was because Peter knew this was the final stop. Maybe it was because some small, terrified part of him was afraid that the pattern would hold, that even Daniel, quiet, kind Daniel, who'd never asked for anything, would turn them away. Or maybe, Peter thought as he watched the countryside scroll past the window, he was afraid of the opposite, afraid of what it would mean if Daniel was the only one who recognized them, the only one who cared. Ruby had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her breathing rough with the cold she was fighting. Peter looked at his wife's face, the lines that 43 years of marriage had etched there, the silver hair that had once been black as night, the hands that had folded 1,000,000 loads of laundry and wiped 1,000 tears. They had given everything to their children, everything except the one thing that might have mattered most, the truth about how easily love could become obligation, how quickly duty could sour into distance. But they were about to learn that truth now, whether they wanted to or not. The bus rolled on toward the farmhouse, toward Jenny's door, toward the answer to the question Peter was no longer sure he wanted to ask. The bus dropped them at a crossroads 7 miles from Daniel's property. There was no shelter here, no taxi stand, no rideshare app that serviced roads this rural, just a faded sign pointing toward town in one direction and farmland in the other, and a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or simply threaten. Peter helped Ruby down the bus steps, feeling every one of his 71 years in his knees and spine. His wife moved slowly, her cough worse than it had been in Seattle, her face pale beneath the grime of 5 days' travel. "We can rest here," Peter offered, nodding toward a wooden bench beneath a bus shelter that had seen better decades. "Catch our breath before we walk." Ruby shook her head. "If I sit down now, I'm not sure I'll get back up. Let's finish this." They walked. The road was unpaved for the last 3 miles, rutted with dried mud and bordered by fields that had already been harvested for the season. Corn stubble stood in neat rows, golden in the late afternoon light. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor hummed, the sound of honest work, the rhythm of a life measured in seasons rather than quarterly reports. Peter thought about his children as they walked, not the strangers who had closed doors in their faces, but the children they had been. Victoria, serious even as a toddler, lining up her dolls in perfect rows. Richard, who'd wanted to be a firefighter until he discovered that lawyers made more money. Margaret, dancing in the living room to records she'd borrowed from the library. Stephen, competitive about everything, crying when he lost at Monopoly until he was 15. And Daniel, who'd never quite fit the mold his siblings had cast, who'd preferred books to sports, quiet conversations to networking events, simple pleasures to ambitious achievements. Daniel, who'd dropped out of his business degree after 2 years and announced he was going to figure things out for a while. Daniel, who'd met Jenny at a farmer's market and called home 3 weeks later to say he was getting married. Peter and Ruby had not taken that news well. They'd tried to talk him out of it. Jenny was a nobody, they'd argued. A woman with no college degree, no career prospects, no family connections that could help Daniel advance. She grew vegetables and kept chickens and lived in a house that her grandmother had left her, a house with no air conditioning and a wood-burning stove. She wore second-hand clothes and drove a truck older than she was, and didn't seem to understand that Daniel was meant for more than this. Ruby had refused to attend the wedding. Peter had gone, but his speech had been stiff, formal, the words of a man doing his duty rather than celebrating his son's happiness. He'd left early, claiming a headache, and hadn't visited the farmhouse since. That was 8 years ago. Now, walking down this dirt road in borrowed rags with his wife coughing beside him, Peter wondered if he'd been wrong about everything. The farmhouse appeared as they crested a small hill, a modest 2-story structure with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch. The paint was peeling in places, and the roof had been patched rather than replaced, but flower boxes hung beneath every window, and the garden stretching behind the house was a riot of organized abundance even this late in the season. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree in the front yard. Children's toys were scattered across the grass. A tricycle, a ball, a small wagon filled with what looked like pine cones. Peter's heart seized. Grandchildren. Daniel had grandchildren he'd never met. Ruby had stopped walking. Her face was a mask of emotion, grief and regret, and something that might have been hope, all tangled together. "I didn't know," she whispered. "He never told us." Would we have listened? Ruby didn't answer. She didn't have to. They approached the front gate, a simple wooden thing with a latch that stuck. Peter was still fumbling with it when the front door opened and a child emerged. A girl, perhaps 4 years old, with wild brown curls and her father's eyes. Daniel's eyes. She was wearing overalls with a smudge of dirt on one knee and carrying a stuffed rabbit that had seen better years. She stopped on the porch and stared at them with the fearless curiosity of the very young. "Are you lost?" she asked. Peter couldn't speak. This was his granddaughter, his blood, and she was looking at him like he was a stranger, because that's exactly what he was. "We're looking for the people who live here," Ruby managed, her voice thick. The girl considered this. "Mommy's inside. She's making soup." She tilted her head. "You look tired, and kind of dirty." "Lily," a woman's voice called from inside. "Who are you talking to?" Footsteps, and then Jenny appeared in the doorway. Peter had only met her twice, at the wedding and once, briefly, at a family gathering that had been tense enough to ensure there were no more invitations. His memory of her was vague, a quiet woman, plainly dressed, who'd seemed intimidated by his other children's accomplishments and his wife's pointed questions about her plans for the future. The woman standing before him now was different, still plainly dressed, jeans, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, an apron dusted with flour, but there was nothing intimidated about her. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, her hands calloused from work, her posture that of someone comfortable in her own skin. She looked at Peter and Ruby standing at her gate, 2 strangers in filthy clothes with exhaustion carved into their faces, and her expression shifted immediately from curiosity to concern. "Oh my goodness," Jenny said, already moving down the porch steps. "Are you all right? Come in, come in. Lily, go tell Daddy we have guests." She unlatched the gate herself and reached for Ruby's arm, supporting her with practiced ease. "When did you last eat?" Jenny asked. "When did you last rest properly? You look like you've been walking for days." Ruby's resolve cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tears she'd been holding since Boston, since Chicago, since every closed door and averted gaze. "I'm sorry," Ruby whispered. "We don't mean to intrude. We just—" "Hush," Jenny said gently. "You're not intruding. You're exactly where you need to be. Come inside. I've got soup on the stove and bread in the oven, and there's a warm fire in the living room. She guided them up the steps and through the front door, never once asking who they were or where they'd come from, never once hesitating. The inside of the farmhouse was small but immaculate, worn wooden floors covered with braided rugs, furniture that was old but well-maintained, the kind of pieces that had been handed down through generations. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves and end tables and window sills. Children's artwork taped to the refrigerator, a fire crackling in a stone hearth. It smelled like soup and fresh bread and wood smoke. It smelled like home. Peter's throat tightened. This was what his son had chosen over corner offices and investment portfolios. This warmth, this simplicity, this life. Jenny settled them on a couch near the fire and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 steaming mugs. "Tea with honey," she explained. "It'll help with that cough." She looked at Ruby with knowing eyes. "You need to see a doctor. That sounds like it's settled in your chest." "We don't have," Peter started. "Let's worry about that later," Jenny interrupted kindly. "Right now you need warmth and food and rest. Everything else can wait." The little girl, Lily, had returned and was now standing in the doorway, watching them with fascination. "Mommy, why are they so dirty?" "Lily, that's not polite." "But they are." Jenny knelt beside her daughter. "Sometimes people have hard times, sweetheart. Sometimes they don't have a house to go home to, or a bathtub to wash in, or clean clothes to wear. When that happens, we help them. We share what we have. Do you understand?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Like when we found the bird with the hurt wing and we took care of it until it could fly again." "Exactly like that." Lily approached the couch with the determination of a child on a mission. She climbed up beside Ruby and offered her the stuffed rabbit. "You can hold Mr. Buttons," she said. "He makes me feel better when I'm sad." Ruby accepted the rabbit with trembling hands. "Thank you, sweetheart. What's your name?" Peter answered before he could stop himself. "I'm Peter. This is my wife, Ruby." "Those are nice names. My grandma's name is Ruby too, but Mommy says she lives far away and doesn't visit." The words were innocent, but they landed like blows. Peter saw Ruby flinch, saw her arms tighten around the stuffed rabbit, as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Jenny had noticed. Her eyes flickered between her daughter and her guests, and something unreadable crossed her face. "Lily, why don't you go help Daddy in the workshop? Tell him dinner will be ready soon." "But I want to stay with the visitors." "You can see them at dinner. Go on now." The child obeyed reluctantly, casting curious glances over her shoulder as she went. When the door closed behind her, Jenny turned back to Peter and Ruby. For a long moment, she simply looked at them. Her gaze was steady, searching, not suspicious, but thoughtful. Peter felt certain she was about to ask questions they weren't prepared to answer. Instead, she said, "The bathroom is upstairs, first door on the left. There are clean towels in the cabinet and soap in the dish. Take as long as you need. I'll find some clean clothes that might fit." "We can't," Ruby started. "You can," Jenny said firmly. "And you will. Whatever brought you to my door, whatever you've been through, right now you're my guests. And in this house, we take care of our guests." She helped Ruby up the stairs while Peter sat frozen on the couch, trying to process what was happening. 4 of his children, successful, wealthy, educated, had turned him away without a second thought. This woman, the daughter-in-law they'd dismissed and avoided for 8 years, had opened her door without hesitation. He heard water running upstairs, heard Jenny's voice, gentle and patient, asking if Ruby needed help, heard his wife's quiet sobs and Jenny's soothing responses. Peter put his face in his hands. What had they done? What had they become? That they'd written off this woman, this kind, generous woman, simply because she didn't fit their image of success. Footsteps on the stairs drew his attention. Jenny descended alone, moving directly to the kitchen where she began ladling soup into bowls. "Your wife is resting in the bath?" she said without looking up. She was more exhausted than she wanted to admit. "The cough worries me. We should have the doctor look at her tomorrow, if it hasn't improved." "You don't have to do this," Peter said. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Jenny paused, ladle in hand. When she turned to face him, her expression was calm but direct. "Mr. Peter," she said, "I don't help people because I know them or because they've earned it. I help people because they need it. That's how I was raised. That's how I'm raising my children. And that's the only way I know how to live." She returned to her task, slicing bread with efficient movements. My grandmother used to say that every stranger is just a friend you haven't met yet. Maybe that sounds naive to some people. Maybe it's foolish to open your door to anyone who knocks. But I'd rather be foolish and kind than smart and cruel. Peter thought of Victoria's $20 bill, of Richard's security guard, of Margaret's catering leftovers, of Stephen's refusal to even open his door. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," he said quietly. She was. She also said that you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. Jenny set a bowl of soup on the table. "Come eat. You need your strength." The soup was simple. Vegetables from the garden, herbs from the windowsill, broth made from scratch. But it was the best thing Peter had tasted in days. Maybe the best thing he'd tasted in years. Each spoonful warmed him from the inside out, thawing something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it was cold. The front door opened, and Daniel walked in. Peter's breath caught. His son had changed in 8 years, filled out, grown into himself, acquired the weathered look of a man who worked with his hands, but his eyes were the same, kind, earnest, worried right now, as they took in the stranger at his table. "Jenny?" Lily said we had guests. "This is Peter and Ruby," Jenny said smoothly. "They were traveling and needed somewhere to rest. They'll be staying with us for a bit." Daniel looked at Peter, looked hard, the way you look at something you can't quite place. Peter's heart hammered. This was it. Daniel would recognize them, would see through the disguise, would know. "Nice to meet you," Daniel said, extending his hand. "I'm Daniel. Welcome to our home." He didn't know. His own son didn't recognize him. Peter shook Daniel's hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the warmth of a grip that was firm but not competitive. Not trying to prove anything, just honest. "Thank you," Peter managed, "for your hospitality. Jenny's the hospitable one. I just live here." Daniel smiled, a genuine smile, nothing like the professional masks his siblings wore. "Is that Mom's vegetable soup? I've been dreaming about it all day." "Sit down and eat," Jenny said. "You've been working since dawn." The family gathered around the table. Daniel, Jenny, Lily, and a boy of perhaps 2 who'd been napping and was now rubbing his eyes in a high chair. The children chattered about their day, while Daniel listened with patience, and Jenny moved between them all, filling plates, wiping faces, keeping order with effortless grace. Ruby joined them halfway through the meal, wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on her frame, her hair damp from the bath but her face clean for the first time in days. She moved slowly, carefully, but there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Jenny immediately rose to help her to the table. Daniel pulled out a chair. Lily began describing, in extensive detail, the bug she'd found in the garden that morning. "Sit here, Miss Ruby," Lily instructed. "Next to me. I'll share my bread with you because you look like you need extra." "Thank you, sweetheart." Ruby's voice was thick with emotion. "That's very kind. Mommy says kindness is free, but it's worth more than gold. Your mommy is very smart." Jenny and Daniel exchanged glances, the wordless communication of a couple who'd learned to read each other's silences. Daniel's eyes lingered on Ruby, then shifted to Peter, and for a moment Peter thought he saw a flicker of something. Recognition? Suspicion? But Daniel said nothing. He simply passed the bread basket and asked if they needed more soup. After dinner, Jenny showed them to a small guest room at the back of the house. It was simply furnished, a double bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser with a mirror, a window overlooking the garden, but it was clean and warm and private. "The bathroom is just down the hall," Jenny said. "There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. Breakfast is at 7, but don't feel obligated to join us. Sleep as long as you need." "Why are you doing this?" Ruby asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "You don't know anything about us. We could be anyone. We could be dangerous." Jenny smiled. "With respect, ma'am, you're about as dangerous as the barn cats. And I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Because my grandmother took in strangers when she was alive, and my mother did the same, and I believe that kindness is the rent we pay for our place on this earth." She paused at the door. "Also," she added quietly, "because I know what it feels like to be judged unworthy, to have people look at you and decide, before they know anything about you, that you're not good enough. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone. So, in this house, everyone is worthy. Everyone is welcome. No exceptions." She closed the door softly behind her. Peter and Ruby stood in the center of the small room, surrounded by evidence of a life they'd dismissed and a kindness they hadn't earned. "She knows," Ruby whispered. "She has to know." "No," Peter shook his head. "She doesn't. She's just like this. This is who she is." Ruby sank onto the bed, her face crumpling. "We were so wrong about her, Peter. So terribly, unforgivably wrong. We looked at her and saw everything she didn't have. The degree, the career, the connections. We never saw who she actually was." Peter sat beside his wife and took her hand. "We were wrong about a lot of things," he said. "About her, about Daniel, about what matters. Our other children." Ruby couldn't finish the sentence. "I know. They didn't even look at us. Their own parents, and they couldn't be bothered to look. I know. But Jenny, a woman we've ignored and dismissed for 8 years. She looked. She saw. She opened her door." Peter thought about the test they'd designed, the experiment meant to reveal his children's true characters. He'd expected to learn something painful. He hadn't expected to learn something about himself. "What do we do now?" Ruby asked. Peter didn't have an answer. He just held his wife's hand and listened to the sounds of the farmhouse settling around them, the creak of old wood, the distant murmur of Daniel and Jenny putting the children to bed, the wind rustling through trees outside their window. They had come looking for truth. They had found it, but the truth was more complicated than they'd imagined, and the path forward was unclear. For now, they were warm, they were fed, they were safe. And for the first time, in longer than Peter could remember, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The days at the farmhouse folded into one another like pages in a well-loved book. Peter woke each morning to sounds he hadn't heard in decades, a rooster announcing the dawn, children's laughter drifting up from the kitchen, the rhythmic creak of someone working a hand pump at the well. These were the sounds of a life lived close to the earth, a life measured in seasons and sunrises rather than stock prices and quarterly reports. On their third morning, Peter came downstairs to find Jenny already at the stove, the children eating oatmeal at the table, and Ruby, his Ruby, who hadn't cooked a meal in their own kitchen in 5 years, standing beside Jenny, learning how to make biscuits from scratch. "You have to work the dough gently," Jenny was explaining, her flour-dusted hands demonstrating the technique. "Too much handling, and they'll come out tough. My grandmother used to say biscuits are like relationships. They need a light touch and plenty of warmth." Ruby laughed. Actually laughed. Peter couldn't remember the last time he'd heard that sound. "Your grandmother had a saying for everything, didn't she?" Ruby asked. "She did. Drove my mother crazy sometimes. But she was usually right." Jenny glanced up and saw Peter in the doorway. "Good morning, Mr. Peter. Coffee's on the counter. Daniel's already out checking the fences, but he'll be back for breakfast." Peter poured himself a cup and settled into a chair at the table. Lily immediately scooted her chair closer to him. "Mr. Peter, do you know any stories?" she asked. "Daddy tells the best stories, but he's working. Maybe you know some too." Peter's throat tightened. He'd told stories once, bedtime stories, mostly, to 5 children who'd gathered around him like he was the most important person in the world. When had he stopped? When had the stories given way to lectures about grades and careers and making something of yourself? "I might know a few," he said carefully. "Tell me one about a princess." "Lily, let Mr. Peter eat his breakfast first," Jenny said, sliding a plate of eggs in front of him. "It's all right." Peter found himself smiling. "I think I can manage a story and breakfast at the same time." He told Lily about a princess who lived in a tall tower, not because she was trapped, but because she loved watching the stars. The princess had everything she could want, gold and jewels and beautiful dresses, but she was lonely because everyone who visited only wanted things from her. Then one day, a simple farmer came to the tower, not to ask for anything, but to share his lunch, because he thought she looked hungry. "Did the princess marry the farmer?" Lily asked, her eyes wide. "She did, and they lived in a little cottage with a garden and chickens, and the princess discovered that she'd never really been rich until she learned how to be happy." Lily considered this. "That's a good story, but I think it needs a dragon." "Every story needs a dragon," Peter agreed. "Maybe next time." Ruby caught his eye across the kitchen, her expression soft with something that might have been wonder. They'd lived in the same house for 4 decades, but Peter felt like he was seeing his wife clearly for the first time in years, seeing the woman she'd been before success and status had calcified around them like armor. After breakfast, Jenny put Peter to work. "We don't have guests here often," she explained. handing him a basket and a pair of garden shears. "But when we do, everyone contributes what they can. Think you can handle harvesting some tomatoes?" Peter looked at his hands. Soft hands. Hands that hadn't done physical labor in years. "I can try." The garden was Jenny's kingdom. Rows of vegetables stretched in neat lines, each plant labeled with hand-painted markers. Tomatoes ripened on sturdy vines. Squash sprawled across the ground like lazy cats. Herbs bordered every pathway, their scents mingling in the morning air. Peter worked slowly, carefully, learning to distinguish ripe from nearly ripe, damaged from salvageable. The sun warmed his back, the soil smelled alive, and somewhere along the way, his mind quieted in a way it hadn't in years. Daniel found him there an hour later. "Jenny's got you working, I see." Daniel leaned against the fence, his face shaded by a battered baseball cap. "She does that. Says idle hands make idle minds." "It's good work," Peter said, honest. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the garden with the practiced gaze of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and when. "That's what I love about it. No politics, no games. You plant something, you take care of it, it grows. There's a purity to that." Peter set down his basket. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why this life? You could have done anything, been anything. Why choose?" He gestured at the fields, the modest house, the chickens scratching in their coop. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, unhurried. "When I was in college, studying business like my father wanted, I used to have these dreams. Nightmares. Really. I was in a building made of glass, and everyone around me was shouting numbers, and I was trying to find a door, but there weren't any, just glass walls that went up forever." He pulled a weed from beside the fence post, examined it, tossed it aside. "Then I came out here one summer to help a friend fix up his grandmother's barn, and the first night I slept better than I had in years. No dreams, just peace." He smiled. "Met Jenny at the farmer's market that same week. She was selling tomatoes. I bought 12 pounds just to keep talking to her." 12 pounds of tomatoes? Made a lot of sauce that summer. Daniel's smile faded into something more serious. "My family doesn't understand. They think I failed because I didn't follow the path they laid out. But I didn't fail, Mr. Peter. I just chose differently. I chose this garden, this house, this woman who sees the world the way I do. I chose to measure my life in moments with my kids, instead of meetings with clients." Peter thought of his own children, the corner offices, the designer clothes, the vacations to places they could barely pronounce, the missed birthdays and rushed phone calls and holidays that felt like obligations rather than celebrations. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Not for a second. Do I wish my parents understood? Sure. Do I wish they'd visit, get to know Jenny and the kids, see that this life isn't lesser just because it's simpler?" Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yeah, I wish that. But I can't make them see what they've decided not to look at." The words landed like stones in Peter's chest. "What if they came around?" Peter asked carefully. "What if they realized they'd been wrong?" Daniel shrugged. "Honestly, I don't know. I've spent 8 years waiting for a phone call that never comes. At some point, you have to stop waiting and just live your life." He clapped Peter on the shoulder, a gesture so casual, so familiar, that it nearly broke Peter's composure. "Anyway, thanks for helping in the garden. Jenny will be happy with those tomatoes." Daniel walked back toward the workshop, leaving Peter alone with his guilt and his grief and the unbearable weight of everything he'd failed to see. Ruby's cough worsened on the 4th day. What had started as a raspy annoyance in Seattle had deepened into something that rattled in her chest and left her breathless after climbing the stairs. Jenny noticed immediately, the way Jenny seemed to notice everything. "I'm calling Dr. Harmon," she announced, her tone brooking no argument. "He does house calls for folks who can't make it into town. Don't worry about the cost. He takes payments in vegetables and fixes from Daniel." "We can't ask you to," Ruby started. "You didn't ask. I'm insisting." Jenny was already reaching for the phone. "My grandmother died of pneumonia because she was too proud to let anyone help her. I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone under my roof." Dr. Harmon arrived that afternoon, a weathered man in his 60s with a black bag that looked like it had survived several decades of house calls. He listened to Ruby's chest, checked her temperature, and asked questions with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen everything. "Walking pneumonia," he diagnosed. "Not severe yet, but it will be if she doesn't rest. I'm prescribing antibiotics and at least a week of bed rest. No arguments." "A week?" Ruby looked stricken. "We can't impose on these people for a week." Jenny crossed her arms. "It's not an imposition. It's hospitality. There's a difference." Dr. Harmon patted Ruby's hand. "Mrs. Ruby, I've known Jenny since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. When this woman decides to take care of someone, you might as well settle in and let her. Fighting it just wears you out." So Ruby settled in. And Peter watched as his wife received the kind of care they'd never allowed anyone to give them. Jenny brought soup and tea at regular intervals. She sat by Ruby's bed and read aloud from novels she'd pulled from the living room shelves. She taught Lily to be quiet in the afternoons so Miss Ruby could sleep. She changed the sheets, opened the windows for fresh air, and applied mustard plasters to Ruby's chest with the confidence of someone who'd learned medicine from generations of women before her. "Where did you learn all this?" Ruby asked one evening, her voice still hoarse but stronger than it had been. Jenny was adjusting the pillows, her movements gentle but efficient. "My grandmother mostly, and my mother, before she passed. We couldn't always afford doctors when I was growing up, so we learned to do what we could with what we had." She smoothed the quilt. "Willow bark for fevers, honey and ginger for coughs, soup for everything else. You would have made a good nurse." "I thought about it, once. Going to school, getting a degree." Jenny sat in the chair beside the bed. "But then my grandmother got sick, and someone needed to take care of the farm, and life happened, I guess. I don't regret it. This life, this place, it's where I'm supposed to be." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever resent us, Daniel's family, I mean, for not accepting you?" Jenny's expression flickered, a brief shadow crossing her face before the calm returned. "I used to. When we first got married and his mother refused to come to the wedding, I cried for 3 days. I couldn't understand how a mother could do that to her own son. How a family could reject someone they'd never even tried to know. And now? Now I feel sorry for them." Jenny's voice was soft but steady. "They're missing out on so much. Lily asks about her grandparents sometimes, why they never visit, why they don't call on her birthday. I don't know what to tell her. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that some people value status over love?" Ruby closed her eyes, but not before Peter saw the tears gathering. "I should let you rest," Jenny said, rising from the chair. "The soup is on the nightstand. Try to eat a little more if you can." She was almost to the door when Ruby spoke. "Jenny." "Yes, thank you. For everything. For being exactly who you are." Jenny smiled. "That's the easiest thing in the world, Mrs. Ruby. Being who you are. The hard part is when other people won't let you." She closed the door gently behind her. Peter, who had been standing in the hallway listening, pressed his back against the wall and tried to remember how to breathe. On the 6th day, Peter made a decision. Ruby was finally improving, eating full meals, taking short walks around the house, laughing with Lily over picture books. The antibiotics were working, and color had returned to her cheeks. But they couldn't stay forever, hidden behind fake names and borrowed clothes, accepting kindness they weren't sure they deserved. "We have to tell them," Peter said that night, after Jenny and Daniel had gone to bed. Ruby nodded slowly. "I know. I've known for days. I'm afraid." "Of what?" "That they'll hate us. That Jenny will realize she's been taking care of the people who rejected her, and it'll ruin everything. That we'll lose this." She gestured at the small room, the warm bed, the sounds of a peaceful house settling around them. "We'll lose whatever this is." Peter took her hand. "We might, but we can't keep lying to them. They deserve better than that. Jenny deserves better." "And Daniel?" Peter thought of his son. The quiet strength, the calloused hands, the easy way he moved through a life built on purpose rather than performance. Daniel deserves to know that his father finally sees him, really sees him, even if it's too late. They agreed to tell them the next morning, at breakfast, when the whole family would be together. But fate had other plans. The storm rolled in around midnight, the kind of sudden, violent weather that transforms the world in minutes. Lightning cracked the sky open, and rain came down like a judgment, flooding the fields and turning the dirt road to mud. Peter woke to shouting, "The barn! The new lambs are in the barn!" He was out of bed and down the stairs before he fully understood what was happening. Daniel was pulling on boots by the door, his face grim. Jenny was already outside, her coat soaked through, running toward the barn where orange light flickered in ways that had nothing to do with lightning. Fire. The barn was on fire. Peter ran after them, his old legs protesting, his heart pounding with terror and adrenaline. The barn was fully engulfed on one side, flames licking up wooden walls, despite the rain. Inside, animals screamed. Sheep, chickens, the old mare that Lily loved to feed carrots to. Daniel was already inside, emerging seconds later with a lamb under each arm, his face blackened with smoke. "There are more! The back stalls!" Jenny grabbed the lambs and deposited them in the safety of the yard, then turned back toward the inferno. "The feed storage, if that catches." Peter didn't think, he just moved. Later, he wouldn't remember the details clearly. The heat searing his lungs, the smoke stinging his eyes, the sound of timbers groaning overhead. He remembered finding the mare's stall, remembered fumbling with a latch that wouldn't cooperate, remembered the animal's wild eyes and his own voice, calm somehow, talking her through the doorway and into the rain. He remembered Daniel's shout, "The roof! Get out!" And then the world collapsed around him. Peter woke in a hospital bed, his head pounding and his left arm immobilized in a cast. Ruby was beside him, her face streaked with tears. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed. Jenny sat in a chair by the window, Lily asleep in her lap. "The barn?" Peter asked, his voice a rasp. "Gone." Daniel's voice was tight. "But we got all the animals out, thanks to you." Peter blinked. "I didn't. You saved the mare. You went back for her when the roof was already coming down. If you hadn't gotten her out when you did." Daniel shook his head. "You could have been killed. You almost were." Ruby's hand found his uninjured one and gripped it hard. A beam fell. "Daniel pulled you out." Peter looked at his son, really looked, seeing the burns on his hands, the singed hair, the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. This man had run into a burning building to save his father. A father who hadn't even claimed him. "Daniel." The name came out broken. "Daniel, I need to tell you something." "It can wait. You need to rest." "It can't wait. It's waited too long already." Peter struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain that shot through his body. Ruby helped him, her hands trembling but steady. "There's something you need to know about who we are." Daniel's expression shifted, confusion, concern, the first flicker of something that might have been suspicion. "Peter," Jenny started. "That's not my real name." Peter met his son's eyes, willing him to understand. "My name is Peter Grayson, and this is my wife, Ruby, your mother." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hospital machinery seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's face went through a cascade of emotions. Disbelief, shock, anger, and something that looked heartbreakingly like hope, before settling into a mask of careful blankness. "What?" His voice was barely a whisper. "We came to test our children." Ruby's voice broke on the words. "We disguised ourselves as homeless strangers to see who would help us, to see who remembered what we taught them about kindness. Victoria turned us away." Peter forced himself to continue, though each word felt like a confession dragged from his chest. "Richard, Margaret, Stephen, 4 of your siblings, and none of them recognized us. None of them even tried. But you did." Ruby was crying now, making no effort to hide it. "You and Jenny, you opened your door. You fed us. You took care of us. You treated 2 strangers with more love than our own children." She couldn't continue. Daniel hadn't moved. His stillness was terrifying. "You lied to us." His voice was flat, dangerous. "You came into our home. You ate at our table. You let Jenny take care of you for a week. And the whole time, we were wrong." Peter's voice cracked. "We were wrong about everything. About you, about Jenny, about what matters in this life. We spent 8 years punishing you for not following the path we laid out, and we missed everything. We missed your wedding. We missed your children being born. We missed who you actually are. And you thought this?" Daniel gestured at the hospital room. "The bandages, the entire impossible situation, would fix that? We thought we could learn the truth about our family." Ruby reached toward Daniel, then stopped, her hand falling back to her side. "We did. The truth is that we raised 4 children who care more about appearances than people, and we raised 1 child who understood what we never managed to teach ourselves." Daniel turned away, his shoulders rigid. Jenny, who had been listening in silence, finally moved. She set Lily gently in the chair, the girl still miraculously asleep, and walked to stand beside her husband. She didn't speak. She just placed her hand on his arm and waited. Minutes passed. Peter watched his son's back, remembering all the times he'd turned away from Daniel, dismissed his choices, refused to see the man he'd become. How many times had Daniel stood like this? Shoulders braced against judgment, waiting for a blow that always came. When Daniel finally turned around, his eyes were wet. "You missed her first word," he said quietly. "Lily's. It was, Mama. She said it right there in the kitchen, and I called you that night. I called to share it with you. And you said," his voice wavered, "you said you were busy, that you'd call back. You never did." Ruby made a sound, like something breaking. "You missed Noah's birth, your grandson. I sat in that waiting room for 12 hours and I wanted—" Daniel stopped, swallowed hard. "I wanted my parents. I wanted someone to tell me it would be okay. But you weren't there. You've never been there." "We should have been." Peter's voice was barely audible. "We should have been there for all of it." "Yes, you should have." Another silence. Then Jenny spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Daniel, look at them." Daniel shook his head, not in refusal, but in overwhelm. "Look at your mother. She has pneumonia because she spent a week on buses trying to reach your siblings. Look at your father. He has a broken arm because he ran into a burning barn to save our animals." Jenny squeezed her husband's arm. "They made mistakes, terrible ones, but they're here now, and they almost died trying to find their way back to you. That doesn't erase 8 years. No, it doesn't." Jenny moved to stand between Daniel and his parents, a bridge across impossible distance. "But it's a start, and I've learned that sometimes a start is all we get. We can waste it, or we can build on it." She looked at Peter, then at Ruby, a long, measuring look that seemed to see straight through to their souls. "I knew," she said simply. Peter's heart stopped. "What?" "I knew who you were. Not right away. The first night, I genuinely didn't recognize you. But by the second day, I'd figured it out." The way Ruby looked at Lily. The way Peter told that story about the princess. Little things that didn't add up until they did. "Why didn't you say anything?" Ruby whispered. Jenny's smile was sad and kind all at once. "Because I wanted you to see. I wanted you to spend time in our home, with our children, living our life. I wanted you to understand that what we have here isn't less than what your other children have. It's more. It's everything that matters." She took a breath. "And I wanted to give you the chance to tell the truth yourselves, to choose honesty when you could have kept hiding. That matters too." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of shock or anger, but the silence of things shifting, rearranging, finding new positions after an earthquake. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at Jenny, something unspoken passing between them. Then he looked at his parents. Really looked, the way Peter had looked at him in the garden. "I don't know how to do this," Daniel said finally. "I don't know how to go from 8 years of silence to whatever this is supposed to be." "Neither do we," Peter admitted, "but we'd like to try, if you'll let us." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, but real. "There's a lot to work through, a lot of hurt that doesn't just disappear. We know. I'm not going to pretend everything is fine. I'm not going to act like this is some fairy tale where the ending makes up for the story. We wouldn't ask you to." Daniel looked at Jenny again. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "But," Daniel said slowly, "the barn needs rebuilding. I could use an extra pair of hands when that arm heals." He paused. "If you're willing to stick around long enough to use them." Peter felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for years. "I'd like that. And Lily," Jenny added softly, "has been asking why Mr. Peter and Miss Ruby have the same names as her grandparents." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I think it might be time to explain." Ruby laughed through her tears. "She's going to have so many questions." "She always does." Daniel's voice was still guarded, but beneath the caution, Peter heard something he hadn't heard in years. Hope, fragile and tentative, but real. "The doctor says I can leave tomorrow," Peter said. "If you have room for us a little longer." Daniel nodded slowly. "The guest room is yours, but no more lies, no more games. If you're going to be part of this family, you're going to be part of all of it. The hard work, the early mornings, the chickens that need feeding at dawn." "I think," Peter said, "I'd like that very much." 3 weeks after the fire, the barn was a skeleton of new timber rising against the autumn sky. Peter worked alongside Daniel every day. His healing arm still in a brace, but his good hand learning the rhythm of honest labor. They spoke little at first, the silence between them filled with sawdust and the ring of hammers, but gradually, words began to fill the gaps. Small things, stories from Daniel's childhood that Peter had forgotten, observations about the weather, The animals. The way Lily had started calling them Grandpa Peter and Grandma Ruby, as if she'd been doing it all her life. Ruby had fully recovered, and she'd become Jenny's shadow in the kitchen and garden. The two women moved around each other with an ease that seemed impossible given their history, but Ruby had discovered something she'd never expected. She genuinely liked her daughter-in-law. More than liked, she admired her. Jenny's quiet strength, her unshakable kindness, her ability to find joy in simple things. These weren't weaknesses, as Ruby had once believed. They were the rarest kind of wealth. "I wasted so many years," Ruby said one evening, helping Jenny preserve the last of the tomatoes. "I could have known you. I could have been here for all of this." Jenny sealed a jar and set it aside. "You're here now. That's what matters. How can you be so forgiving? After everything we did, everything we didn't do?" Jenny was quiet for a moment, her hands still working. "When I was 12, she said finally, "my father left, just walked out one day, and never came back. My mother fell apart. I spent years being angry. At him, at her, at the world. And you know what that anger got me? Nothing but a stomachache and sleepless nights." She looked at Ruby directly. "Forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was okay. It's about deciding you're not going to carry the weight of it anymore. You and Peter hurt Daniel. That's true. But holding on to that hurt won't change the past. It'll just poison the future." Ruby wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Your grandmother taught you that?" "She taught me a lot of things," Jenny smiled. "Mostly by example. She took in strays, animals, people, anyone who needed a place to land. She used to say that a house isn't a home until it's sheltered someone who had nowhere else to go." "She sounds remarkable." She was. "I think she would have liked you, Ruby. Once she got past the fancy clothes and the attitude." Ruby laughed. A real laugh. Warm and unguarded. "I think I would have liked her too." Peter was on the porch, drinking coffee and watching Lily chase chickens around the yard, when his phone buzzed. He'd turned it back on a few days earlier, a concession to practicality, but he'd ignored most of the messages that had accumulated during their weeks of silence. This call was from Victoria. He stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. "Dad?" Victoria's voice was sharp with something. Irritation? Worry? It was hard to tell with her. "Where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for weeks." Mom's phone goes straight to voicemail. "We've been traveling." "Traveling? You're 71 years old. You can't just disappear without telling anyone." Peter felt something harden in his chest. "We were testing something." "Testing what?" "Dad, you're not making sense." Richard called a meeting. He wants to discuss the estate planning while everyone's still healthy enough to make decisions. "We need you and Mom in Boston by this weekend." The estate. Of course. That's what this was about. Not concern for their well-being, but concern for their money. "Actually," Peter said slowly, "I think a family meeting is an excellent idea, but it won't be in Boston. It'll be here." "Here? Where's here?" "Daniel's farm, in Millbrook." The silence on the other end was deafening. "You're at Daniel's?" Victoria's voice dripped with disbelief. "Why would you possibly?" "Because this is where we belong," Peter interrupted. "Tell the others, Saturday at noon. If they want to discuss family matters, they can come to where the family actually is." He hung up before she could argue. Ruby appeared in the doorway, her expression questioning. "Who was that?" "Victoria. She wants a family meeting about the estate." And I told her to come here. All of them." Ruby's face went pale. "Peter, are you sure?" "No." He reached for her hand. "But I think it's time they learned what we learned, don't you?" Saturday dawned crisp and golden, the kind of autumn day that made the world look like it was holding its breath. Jenny had been cooking since Thursday. Not to impress, she insisted, but because feeding people was how she showed love. The kitchen smelled of roasting chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie. "You don't have to do all this," Ruby told her, helping arrange plates on the long farmhouse table. "They don't deserve it." "Maybe not." Jenny slid a tray of biscuits into the oven. "But I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for Daniel. Whatever happens today, he's going to face his siblings with his head high, and that means showing them exactly what they've been too blind to see." Daniel was in the barn, the nearly finished barn, organizing tools and staying busy. Peter found him there, silently counting nails he'd already counted twice. "You don't have to stay for this," Peter said. "If it's too much, I'm not hiding from them anymore." Daniel's jaw was set. "I've spent 8 years being the family disappointment. Today they're going to learn the truth about who disappointed who." Peter nodded. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago. I should have said it every day. Daniel's hands stilled. Dad, you built something real here. A life, a family, a home that actually feels like one. I was so busy measuring success in dollars and degrees that I missed what was right in front of me. My best child was the one I understood least. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. Then he set down the nails and embraced his father. A real embrace, the kind they hadn't shared in decades. Peter felt his son's shoulders shake slightly, felt his own tears fall into the sawdust at their feet. "I'm sorry," Peter whispered. "I'm so sorry for all of it." "I know, Dad, I know." They arrived in a convoy of luxury vehicles that looked absurdly out of place on the dirt road. Victoria first, her Mercedes gleaming despite the dust. Then Richard in his BMW, Margaret and Thomas in their Range Rover, and Stephen in a Tesla that probably cost more than Daniel's entire property. Peter watched them emerge, one by one, their expensive shoes sinking into the honest earth of the farmyard. They looked around with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed contempt. "What is this place?" Margaret muttered, brushing imaginary dirt from her designer jacket. "This is your brother's home," Ruby said, stepping onto the porch. "And you're welcome in it." The siblings exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication families develop over decades, equal parts history and judgment. Victoria was the first to approach. "Mom, you look." She paused, searching for words. "Different." "I feel different." Ruby descended the steps. "Come inside. We have a lot to discuss." The farmhouse kitchen wasn't designed for 9 adults and 2 children, but somehow everyone fit. Jenny had set up folding chairs and extended the table with boards across sawhorses, creating a surface big enough for the whole family. The food covered every inch: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, homemade bread, 3 kinds of pie. "Did you cook all this?" Richard asked Jenny, his tone suggesting he'd expected catering. "I did." Jenny began serving, her movements calm and practiced. "With Ruby's help." "Mom cooks now?" Stephen laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Since when?" "Since I learned there's more to life than restaurants and personal chefs." Ruby's voice was quiet but firm. "Sit down, all of you. Eat. Then your father has something to say." The meal was tense, conversation stilted. The siblings asked polite questions about the farm, the children, Daniel's little handyman business, their words wrapped in condescension they probably didn't even recognize. Lily, oblivious to the tension, chattered about her chickens and her new baby brother, and how Grandpa Peter had been helping rebuild the barn. "Grandpa Peter?" Victoria's eyebrows rose. "How long have you been here exactly?" "Long enough." Peter set down his fork. "Long enough to learn some things I should have understood decades ago." He looked around the table at his children, these successful, polished strangers who bore his name but seemed to have forgotten everything he thought he'd taught them. 3 weeks ago, your mother and I conducted an experiment. We disguised ourselves as homeless travelers and visited each of your homes, asking for help. The silence was immediate and absolute. "Victoria," Peter met his eldest daughter's eyes, "you gave us $20 and directions to a shelter. You didn't look at us long enough to recognize your own parents." Victoria's face went pale. I didn't." "Richard." Peter turned to his eldest son. "You wouldn't even let us into your building. Your doorman called to ask if you knew us, and you said no." Richard's jaw tightened. "Dad, that's—" "Margaret." Peter's voice grew heavier. "You gave us leftover sandwiches from a catering event, food you were going to throw away, and you smiled at us like we were charity cases who should be grateful for scraps." Margaret's husband shifted uncomfortably. She said nothing. "Stephen, you refused to open your door. You told us to find a shelter and stopped answering when we pressed the buzzer." Stephen's face had gone red. "I didn't know it was you. How was I supposed to?" "You weren't supposed to know." Ruby's voice cut through her son's protest. "That was the point. We wanted to see who you would be when you didn't know you were being watched, when there was nothing to gain from being kind." "And Daniel?" Victoria demanded, recovering her composure. "What did the golden child do that was so special?" "Daniel," Peter said quietly. "And Jenny, a woman we ignored for 8 years, a woman we refused to accept into this family, opened their door to 2 dirty strangers without hesitation. They fed us. They gave us clean clothes. They took care of your mother when she developed pneumonia from sleeping in bus stations. They treated us with more dignity in one evening than the 4 of you showed in all the years of your success." The words landed like blows. Peter watched his children's faces cycle through denial, anger, shame, and back again. This is ridiculous. Richard pushed back from the table. You can't judge our entire character based on one moment when we didn't recognize you. That's not fair, isn't it? Jenny spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but clear. When a stranger came to your door, you showed who you really are. That's not judgment, that's truth. And who are you to talk about truth? Victoria snapped. You've been lying to us this whole time, pretending to be homeless, manipulating us into some kind of test. We weren't pretending. Ruby's voice hardened. We were showing you what you've become, children who would step over their own parents to avoid inconvenience. Children who measure human worth in designer labels and job titles. That's not, Margaret started. It is, Peter stood, moving to stand beside Daniel. I raised you to be successful. That was my mistake. I should have raised you to be good. He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. Your brother understood what I failed to teach you, that success without kindness is hollow, that a big house means nothing if you won't open its doors. That family isn't about status, it's about showing up, every day, in every way, for the people who need you. Daniel stood still, his face unreadable, but Peter felt him straighten slightly beneath his hand. I spent 8 years being ashamed of Daniel. Peter's voice cracked. 8 years thinking he'd failed because he didn't follow the path I laid out. But he didn't fail. He succeeded in the only way that matters. He built a life filled with love, not just achievements. He chose a partner based on her heart, not her resume. He's raising children who understand that kindness is free, but worth more than gold. Lily, who had been quietly listening, tugged on Jenny's sleeve. Mommy, why is everyone upset? Jenny smoothed her daughter's hair. Sometimes grown-ups need to learn hard lessons, sweetheart, just like when you learned that hitting isn't nice. Did somebody hit somebody? Not with hands, with words and choices. Victoria stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. You've made your point, Dad. We're terrible people. Congratulations on your moral victory. She grabbed her purse. Richard, Margaret, Stephen, let's go. Sit down, Victoria. Something in Peter's tone made her freeze. I'm not finished. Slowly, reluctantly, she sat. Your mother and I have made a decision. Peter reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. This is our updated will. Richard, as a lawyer, you can verify its authenticity. He unfolded the paper and laid it on the table. We're leaving everything to Daniel and Jenny. The explosion was immediate. Everything? Stephen's voice cracked. The house? The investments? Everything. Peter remained calm. The house in Connecticut, which we're selling. The investment portfolio, the savings accounts, all of it. You can't do this. Richard grabbed the document, scanning it with professional efficiency. We'll contest it. Undue influence, diminished capacity, WHA. Read it carefully. Peter's voice was ice. We had it drafted by a firm your mother selected specifically because they've never met Daniel or Jenny. We've both been evaluated by independent physicians who've confirmed our mental competence. Every legal requirement has been met. This is insane. Margaret's voice rose. You're cutting us out because we didn't recognize you in disguise? That's cruel. No. Ruby moved to stand beside her husband. What's cruel is visiting your mother twice in 5 years. What's cruel is calling only when you need a co-signature or a check. What's cruel is letting us sit alone on Peter's birthday because your lives were too important to spare an evening. She looked at each of her children in turn, these strangers wearing her jeans. What's cruel is becoming exactly what the world taught you to be. Successful, accomplished, impressive, and empty. Silence fell again. This time it was heavier, darker, thick with things that couldn't be unsaid. Finally, Stephen spoke. His voice was different now, quieter, stripped of its usual bravado. Is there anything we can do to fix this? Peter studied his youngest son. Stephen had always been the most competitive, the most driven, the most desperate for approval. Maybe that desperation could be redirected. I don't know, Peter said honestly. Your brother spent 8 years waiting for a phone call that never came. I can't tell you how to repair that. Only Daniel can decide if repair is possible. All eyes turned to Daniel, who had remained silent throughout the explosion. He looked at his siblings, the people who'd shared his childhood, who'd grown into strangers, who'd looked through him for nearly a decade like he didn't exist. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt, Daniel said slowly. And I'm not going to say that money can make up for years of being treated like the family embarrassment. He paused. But I also know what it's like to want your family to see you, to wait for approval that never comes." He looked at Jenny, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "If any of you want to try, really try, not just show up when it's convenient, then my door is open. Not because you deserve it, but because that's who I choose to be." His voice steadied. "But it has to be real. Phone calls, visits, actual interest in our lives. If you come to this farm, you eat at our table and help with the dishes. If you want to know your niece and nephew, you show up for their birthdays and their bad days and the boring Tuesdays in between." He stood straighter. "I'm not interested in being part of a family that only exists on Christmas cards. But if you're willing to be part of a real one, flawed and messy and present, then maybe we can start over." The siblings looked at each other. Peter could see them calculating, weighing, measuring. The habits of a lifetime didn't disappear in a single afternoon. Victoria spoke first. "Daniel, She stopped, took a breath, started again. "I didn't know you had children. I didn't know you'd rebuilt your life out here. I didn't." Her voice broke. "I didn't know anything, because I never asked." It was the closest to an apology Peter had ever heard from his eldest daughter. Richard nodded slowly, his lawyer's facade cracking slightly. "I told myself we'd reconnect eventually, when things slowed down, when the timing was right." He laughed bitterly. "The timing was never right, because I never made it right." Margaret was crying, quiet tears that tracked through her makeup. "I've spent so long trying to be someone important that I forgot who I actually am, who we all used to be." Only Stephen remained silent, his face a war between pride and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Can I see the barn?" he asked finally. "The one Dad helped rebuild?" Daniel looked surprised. "Sure, if you want." "I want to see what you made." Stephen's voice was rough. "What you actually made, with your hands. I've never built anything that would still be standing after I left the room." The brothers walked out together, an unlikely pair, the investment banker in his designer shoes and the farmer in his work boots. Peter watched them go, something loosening in his chest. "This doesn't fix everything." Victoria's voice was closer now. She'd moved to stand beside her father. "You know that, right? One conversation, one afternoon. It doesn't undo years." "No." Peter turned to face her. "But it's a start, and sometimes a start is all we get." The siblings stayed until evening. Not all of them. Richard had to catch a flight, and Margaret and Thomas left shortly after, promising to call, to visit, to do better. Whether they would remain to be seen. But Victoria stayed. She sat on the porch with Ruby, talking in low voices about things Peter couldn't hear but could guess. And Stephen stayed too, helping Daniel in the barn, asking questions about farming and animals, and what it felt like to work with your hands instead of spreadsheets. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jenny called everyone inside for pie. They gathered around the kitchen table, smaller now, more intimate, and for a few minutes, they were just a family sharing dessert. Lily had fallen asleep in Peter's lap, her weight warm and trusting against his chest. He looked down at her peaceful face, his granddaughter, this miracle he'd almost missed, and felt something settle into place inside him. "We're not going back to Connecticut," he announced quietly. Ruby looked at him. "I know. The real estate agent called yesterday. We accepted an offer on the house." Victoria's fork paused midway to her mouth. "You're selling the house? Where will you live?" Peter looked at Daniel. "If your brother will have us, we'd like to stay here. Not in the farmhouse, you need your space. But there's a small cottage on the edge of the property that could be fixed up." "The old groundskeeper's cabin?" Daniel's eyes widened. "Dad, that place is barely standing." "I know," Peter smiled. "I'm hoping you'll teach me how to rebuild it." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then his face broke into a grin, the same grin he'd had as a boy, before the weight of disapproval had taught him to hide it. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." 6 months later, the cabin was finished. It wasn't large, just a bedroom, a bathroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. But it had windows that caught the morning light, and a porch that looked out over the fields, and a garden where Ruby had already begun planting herbs. Peter stood on that porch now, watching the sunrise, a cup of coffee warming his hands. His body ached from the work. Rebuilding a cabin at 71 was no small thing, but it was a good ache, an honest one. Daniel emerged from the main farmhouse, crossing the yard with the easy stride of a man at home in his world. He carried a basket of eggs, still warm from the coop. Jenny says breakfast is ready if you want it. In a minute, Peter gestured to the chair beside him. Sit with me. Daniel sat. They watched the sun climb higher, turning the frost on the fields to diamonds. You know, Daniel said eventually, when I was a kid, I used to imagine what it would be like if you understood me, if you were proud of me for who I was, not who you wanted me to be. And now? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Now I realize that parents are just people, flawed and scared and doing the best they can with what they know. He looked at his father. You hurt me, Dad. For a long time, you hurt me. But I see you now, really see you, and I think maybe that's enough. Peter felt tears prick his eyes. It's more than I deserve. Probably. Daniel's smile softened the word. But that's the thing about family, isn't it? It's not about deserving. It's about choosing to love each other anyway. Lily came running across the yard, her brother toddling behind her, Jenny following with patient steps. Grandma Ruby says the biscuits are ready, and if you don't come now, she's giving yours to the chickens. Peter laughed, a real laugh, deep and full and free. We'd better go then, he told Daniel. Can't let the chickens get our biscuits. They walked to the farmhouse together, 3 generations moving toward warmth and food and the simple miracle of a family meal. Behind them, the sun finished its climb, flooding the valley with golden light. Peter paused at the door, looking back at the land his son had chosen, the life his son had built. The barn they'd raised together stood solid against the sky. The garden stretched in neat rows, ready for spring planting. The cabin he and Ruby now called home nestled at the edge of the property, like it had always been there. Not a single piece of it would have impressed his old colleagues. Not a single photograph of it would generate envy at a cocktail party. It was simple and small and profoundly ordinary. And it was everything. Dad? Daniel held the door open. You coming? Peter took one last breath of the morning air, clean and cold and smelling of wood smoke and possibility. Yeah, he said. I'm coming home.